Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 138. Today we're talking about Stencil. We are your hosts, Justin Ribeiro and Leon Revel. Leon, hey, how's it going?
Brilliant. Thank you, Justin. Hello, everybody.
Danny and Amal have the day off, and by that we mean they're on a plane traveling from somewhere to somewhere else. Before we introduce our guest today and talk about Stencil, which I think will be a very interesting conversation, I'm going to throw it back over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon?
Thanks, Justin. So first up, we've got the Safari Technology Preview 39, which includes updates to the Beacon API, directory upload, and the Fetch API. So Google Chrome 61 has finally dropped into stable, which offers support for JavaScript Modules, Payment Request API, the Web Share API, the Web USB, and lots more, so lots of good things in that release. The Yarn Package Manager has now hit version 1, which adds some new features, such as workspaces and auto-merging of lock files. A new minor version of Vue.js has been released, 2.4.3, with a range of bug fixes. And finally, in This Week in Web, we've got Babel version 7 is now available as a beta with a host of new features and bug fixes. And that's everything for me for This Week in Web this week.
Thank you, Leon. The Web USB stuff in Chrome 61, I'm really excited about. I'm going to post a picture later this week of Web USB in a weird configuration for a progressive web app. It's either people are going to go, I don't think that's normal, but trust me, it works. So I'm really excited about Web USB, amongst other things. Interesting things happening on the web. But we're not here today to talk about the Web USBs of the world. No. Today we're talking about Stencil.js. And our guest this week, Justin Willis, Adam Bradley, thank you both so much for being on the show. Introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about each other.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm Adam Bradley, the lead developer at Ionic. So I've been working on Ionic for a few years now, and I've been heading up Stencil, so it's been a lot of fun.
Yep, and I'm Justin Willis. I am a support engineer on the framework team here at Ionic. Also working on Stencil.
We appreciate you coming back on the show, by the way, Justin. I mean, I know it's confusing given that we have the same name. And last time, it was tough figuring out who was who. But we're going to try real hard this week. Tell us a little bit about Stencil. Like, what is Stencil and, how is it going to change the way we look at the web?
Yeah, I can kind of start that out. So in general, Stencil is a solution to our problem as creates, an author of UI library or library of components, Ionic. What we've been wanting to do is make Ionic available to everyone, not just Angular users. And so with that, over time, we realized that, what kind of web components fit the bill for that. It really started to make a lot of sense. But web components in general didn't really solve the entire problem, is kind of how we saw it. They're great. It's amazing to have them have the browser handle most of the logic, but there's a layer of things that is kind of missing, we feel, and that's where the kind of developer experience of creating a component, having kind of those framework level features, such as allowing the high performance or being able to re-render when you change a property. There's various framework level things that are awesome to have that just web components themselves don't offer. And so that's kind of where Stencil was born. And again, as a solution to Ionic's problem that we have opened up and hope that everyone else really enjoys too. But yeah, we can really get into the low level of how it works, but just in general, it's a way for us to ship Ionic across all the frameworks, not just Angular, and really, or no framework at all, is to really sum it up.
So when you're talking about like framework features, which are really nice to have, we're talking about state management or kind of what's the list there?
Yeah, exactly. So things like you have a property within your component and you change it. You want to make sure that property gets passed down across all the components below it. So think Vue and React and Angular. This is something that works great across those frameworks. It's built in within the framework to allow that data to go down, and then to also performantly make sure that all of the re-rendering happens only when it needs to. I would say that I am a huge fan of Vue.js. I would say that Stencil is heavily inspired by it. Of how Vue works. We're probably the closest to how that works under the hood. But the difference being that we wanted to make sure that we didn't just make, an Ionic Vue version, that we poured all of our components to work within the Vue framework. We want to make sure that as we do this new update, we want to make sure that Ionic worked everywhere. And so that's where the web component layer comes into it. So again, it offers all the framework features, but at the same time, what you compile, what the final rendered version of what you have is just vanilla JavaScript. Very low level, very tiny. I guess I haven't really focused on that at all, is that really Stencil itself is a compiler for web components. So you have an input of, kind of framework concepts, framework code, but the output of it is not a Stencil component. The output of it is just a raw web component that works everywhere. And that's kind of been our main focus, is to bring those two together.
So there's no third-party Stencil.js library to include or any other kind of dependencies. Is that correct?
Exactly. That's exactly right. So there's no window.stencil that exists. There's no, at runtime, there's no Stencil API that people need to understand. It's really just trying to keep it away from framework code. So when you look at like what you're writing, it might feel like you're in a framework. And that's kind of by design. We want you to be able to have the powers of all the cool parts of a great framework. But at the same time, what it builds is something that will last for years. It doesn't have to be dependent on a certain version. You don't have to worry about upgrading it, because the real low level of it is a standard-based web component, or really custom element that the browsers fully understand. And the browsers are all baked into how to, when an attribute changes or when the element hits the DOM, it knows to lazy load our components. And so we want to make sure that the runtime of it wasn't a framework level thing, but it was just raw JavaScript at this point, all standards based.
So in the land of these sorts of things, I mean, walk us through the basics of that sort of first component. Like, we talk a lot about, if it renders down into, just JavaScript and custom elements. By the way, when we talk about web components as a thing, is it using kind of the entire span of all things web components? Or are we just really more focused on the custom elements thing? That's probably an easier place to start.
Yeah, sure. Really, it's focused first on the custom elements. And so you kind of hit on that, where web components is a term that kind of is all-encompassing, includes Shadow DOM, custom elements, templates, all of the major things of a web component. We're focused largely on the custom element part of this. And again, the thing that we really wanted to tie into was that the moment that one of our elements, such as ion button or ion toggle, hits the DOM, then that's when we decide to lazy load the rest of the code, lazy load the CSS, the JavaScript, and then apply that information at that time. Because that was really a problem that we're facing, that we have faced traditionally, is we've got over 60 components in Ionic. And if you want to use one of them, you pretty much have to bring in all of them. And so then the next challenge is try to, well, if you're only using one of them, how do I import just the one and break that apart? And traditionally it's possible with Webpack, but it's not exactly easy. And instead of having the developer have to guess at build time of which component should go in which pages and which one should be bundled together, and all the complexities behind a Webpack configuration, we wanted to keep it simple again, just let them add an element and it's going to lazy load itself. And so that's also part of all of the internals of each of these components, is that we're able to register the bare minimum about a component, which is basically just, this is the tag name. And hey, browser, if you happen to see this tag name, let us know and we'll load the rest of the code. And so this allows each component to be lazy loaded by itself. And so what that really allows is the browser to take control of knowing what things to load on demand. And this isn't exactly a new concept. Polymer is able to pull off things like this too. But we wanted to make sure that it was reusable across Ionic components and existing Ionic users without them having to rewrite their entire applications. And really, again, to allow Ionic Angular developers to continue doing what they already know, but then to enable Ionic to work in React and Vue and Ember and so on and so forth. If that helps answer the question.
So the laser loading stuff sounds really interesting. So I'm just trying to think in my head kind of how that magic kind of works. So when you say you kind of give the browser the bare minimum to understand that element is available, is that basically calling custom elements define? And then you say there's a custom element called ion toggle or whatever, and then when the browser actually sticks that in the DOM, and then the various callback methods are kind of called, you then go and grab all of the assets for that actual element and then load them in that way. Is that similar to how it might work?
Yep, nailed it. That's exactly right. So we register like the bare minimum of all these components, but they're really just kind of proxies. They're just the host elements to our actual thing. And then they go out, so connected callback happens, and then that's where that code goes out and gets the rest of the code and connects the two together. And so with us doing that, we're able to, because we have that separation between the element and the actual code, we're able to lazy load everything. And it's actually works really well. We've got some awesome examples of, because the element itself and the code are disconnected, and because the rendering is into a large asynchronous queue, that we're able to batch all the rendering as within the frames as the browser is able to handle them. We can really get some awesome performance, and that kind of comes from directly from React Fiber. And so everything that React Fiber is doing and how they're able to render large amount of changes in a short period of time without locking up the thread, with still allowing the user interaction to happen, still allowing basically not locking up the thread and having janky animations. Because we have an asynchronous queue, because we only allow so much to happen per frame, we're able to have enormous amount of things happen without things becoming janky. And this is all within a very, very small, it's not a framework really. It's a very small bit of code that's able to pull this off. And basically goes to custom elements in the browser and not having to write framework code to figure this out, but allowing the browser to breathe a little bit and let the browser control all that.
The custom elements. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that's very smart, and I wish I'd thought of it myself. When you mentioned like not locking up the UI thread, etc., is web workers involved here at all?
No, they're not, but that's absolutely something that we want to look into. I think the web workers are very intriguing, and we have spent a lot of time with trying to get them to work. But basically not having the DOM and window in a web worker is probably the biggest limiting thing. So it's great to use it for, there's always that example of re-rendering something and keeping the stuff not janky. But passing a large amounts of data between the two is where it kind of breaks down. And I understand that, shared array buffers is really going to solve a lot of this problem. So that's where I'm really excited about this, that with our current architecture, and because we have disconnected the code from the window and document, that we can take advantage of web workers even further moving forward. So yeah, we're really excited to do that. It's just right now it's still kind of a challenge to do when you have a large amount of data passing back between the two. There
was also some browser kind of issues too when we tried web workers. So like Safari had a few issues that just kind of we ran into it and made it hard to implement. But I think in the near future, some of those little things will be fixed. Adam could probably tell you that he spent plenty of time wrestling with Safari to try to get things working.
We did, the classic like lazy load images and resize them and all that stuff. We had working examples on our computers, of course, and that's the easy part. But once we put it into iOS Safari, there was a lot of quirky bugs. And again, passing the data back after you're done passing around the data, you didn't really save much performance wise. And then also when we threw it into Cordova, which is where most of our users live right now, it was using UI WebView, which also had many quirky web worker issues. So I'm a huge fan of them, but at the time we were experimenting with them a couple months ago, they were still a little early yet. But absolutely, again, with our current structure, I'm pretty excited that we can start using them more so.
I think that's kind of the interesting thing to me in terms of your approach to Stencil, is because there are still a lot of quirks out there. We all know this. I mean, we were talking just before we started the episode about quirks. or at least when I say talk, it was mostly me complaining about quirks. So if you're out there going, oh, it was a constructive conversation. No, it was mostly just me ranting. But Stencil uses custom elements API, and I find that a lot of people really like the custom elements API, and it seems to be a leap point into more browser use the platform sort of APIs. Because the custom element API, to me, seems very accessible through a wide range of things, and there are not as many quirks in it anymore as with some of the other things, like the constant debate that Danny and I argue about with Shadow and things of that nature. Custom elements really seems to be like a really nice entry point into a lot of these more performant things the platform is bringing forward.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting. Just in general, people, think that, React versus web components. I don't think that's a fair comparison at all. It's kind of apples to oranges. But the custom element spec is very simple. And that's the power that I love about it, is that it lets me know when a custom element has gone into the DOM, and it lets me know when an attribute has changed. And that's kind of the extent of it. That's why it's nice that Shadow DOM, custom elements, all the 4 different major players of web components are separated. That because of that, I think many frameworks are going to be able to take advantage of this. And I think we're just entering this new era where many of them will start kind of to follow the path of using more custom element spec, which I see that happening soon. So, and I think it really goes credit to the the browsers that made it happen, and also it's now shipping in Safari and iOS. It's being worked on in Edge. It's already behind a flag in Firefox. So it's absolutely, in my opinion, the future of web development is custom elements.
So I would like to just briefly talk about Shadow DOM a little bit, because arguably it is, the most powerful feature of web components. Obviously maybe on par with custom elements. Some people don't like it. Some people would prefer a more declarative Shadow DOM and those kind of things. But is there support in Stencil to create web components with Shadow DOM, or will there be? Or what's your view on Shadow DOM as a whole?
Yeah, it's a tough one. So again, this all stems from, we created this as a internal tool for Ionic to ship our components to all of the frameworks. So with that, it includes Ionic Angular. And so for the last 3-4 years, people have been building Ionic apps with certain CSS specific rules of how their stuff works. And so we actually did start porting Ionic to use Shadow DOM when we first started this. And we had nothing but issues, and we realized that what we would end up doing is having all of our users rewrite their entire applications. They would then have to learn Shadow DOM, which is a kind of ever-changing spec at the moment. We would then have to document all of the different CSS variables that are possible, and then they have to read about them. So there was a lot of kind of drawbacks to Shadow DOM for Ionic's problem. And so I think it's more of a problem for UI library authors than it is for users. But in general, I do want to clarify that I think Shadow DOM is awesome, and I think it's great for users. I think it's great to lock down their CSS per component. So I think it's amazing. It's just that as a library for Ionic, it's very difficult, especially for an existing one, to enable it. Because we also pride ourselves on making sure that Ionic is very customizable. We want to make sure that people aren't building an Ionic-looking app, but rather they're using Ionic to build their app. So with that, we've gone out of our way to make sure that we have got 1 or 2 selectors at most. So most of the time, it's just one selector for whatever you want to customize. And just, the average developer or designer can go in and customize that to their own needs. And so when we moved to Shadow DOM, we lost all those abilities and kind of, we then locked in our components and then didn't allow anyone to customize them, which is kind of, Shadow DOM's by design. But it didn't work well for Ionic. And so that's why we chose not to not use it, to not use it for this go around of Ionic components. But that all said, Stencil itself will support Shadow DOM. It'll be just a flag. At this second, it doesn't work, but it'll be just a flag where you can enable it. And that way users can still learn Shadow DOM. They can start to scope all their CSS just how you'd expect it. But I think you also kind of said, I think the challenge is it's a very different API to what people are used to. There's quite a bit to learn. So we we don't really want to force everyone to go all in on day one when you start using Ionic component, but rather just keep using the CSS that you're familiar with. And again, back to all the customization of it. But the exciting part is that there's another spec in the works. What is it called, Justin? The
shadow parts?
Yes, Shadow DOM parts. Yeah, and so that is kind of solving our problem, or that speaks exactly to our problems that we want people to be able to customize our stuff. Because right now the answer is to use CSS variables, which again are great, but in our case, we have to put a CSS variable on every single property value. So we just kind of doubled the size of our CSS, and then we added new docs for people to read. And so it kind of didn't really solve the problem for us. So that's why we're excited about this new version. And then I think the Shadow DOM part spec. So when that comes out, we'd absolutely take advantage of it. And this is an Ionic problem. As far as Stencil is concerned, it would be a flag that you can use Shadow DOM.
Also, I always have some concerns too around like the size of the Shadow DOM polyfills from a load time perspective, and actually from a runtime perspective too. The performance of the Shadow DOM polyfills sometimes leaves some to desire on the runtime side, and then because the polyfill for it is so large, there is some load time issues. And obviously, it's supported in Chrome and Safari now, but there's a decent amount of users out there on Firefox. There's a decent amount of users on Chrome-based browsers that aren't actually updated to the latest Chrome yet, so they would also be using the Shadow DOM polyfill. And yeah, trying to ship that polyfill over a crappy network to a crappy device is not going to be exactly the best experience for the user.
And I just realized the biggest thing that I forgot to mention is because we're not using Shadow DOM, so this is kind of a nice side effect. We're able to server-side render and pre-render all of our components. So like if you go to stenciljs.com right now and view the source, so not just inspect element, but actually view the page source that comes back from the server, you see that everything is already hydrated. And so every single docs page is already hydrated, and it already has the CSS, only the CSS being used by that HTML page. So we already, optimized it to be as minimal as possible. And so what's responding from the server is just HTML, CSS, and is about as fast as you could possibly get that to happen. And then after the fact, the JavaScript kicks in and applies all of its listeners, all of its handlers to the existing elements. It doesn't, delete all of those nodes and repaint the entire thing, but it enhances the existing elements. And so in my opinion, it's the best of both worlds where Google is able to crawl all of the pages. Users are able to get that first paint as fast as possible. And then it is turned into a single page application after that. And so that's all basically enabled because we're not using Shadow DOM. And I know there's also some cool projects out there, especially the Skate.js guys. They have some awesome projects where they're able to server-side render their components, and they use Shadow DOM. So I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's one thing that definitely helped us out was to stay away from it at the moment.
Shadow definitely has its ups and downs. As someone who likes Shadow, it's definitely not something that's very easy to get into when you have existing legacy. I totally agree with you. Primarily because it does require a rethinking of how you apply things up and down the chain. And I know Tab's working on Shadow Parts, which there's a draft of it, I think, on probably in his GitHub account of part and theme, which will ideally make some of that life a little bit easier. Because right now, obviously, it's not, depending on what you have in your light and then how you, whether you're delivering it purely through the light DOM, which means you can style it from the top, or whether you're doing fancy tricks like using light DOM cloning and things like that. You can do crazy things with it to get quite a bit of performance out of it that still works with things like the shady DOM. But, I readily admit I don't think it's the easiest thing. Leon, do you probably have an opinion of this as well?
So I think all of the points that Adam was making are completely valid. CSS variables, they work really great for simple things, but when you're talking about the way you'd obviously want to customize Ionic components, it's going to be, you can have like 4 million different CSS variables and it's all going to be really confusing. And again, the polyfill is quite big, and obviously it doesn't polyfill everything. And then I think the biggest problem with Shadow DOM at the moment, and again, I'm a massive fan of it. I love it, and it's amazing. But the biggest problem with it is if you have to support platforms which both do and don't support it, then you get into some really kind of styling headaches where you've got to style in one way for the platforms that support the Shadow DOM encapsulation. And then obviously, even using the shady CSS polyfill on the platforms that don't natively support it, you're still going to get obviously style bleeding into the components, which is a headache. So it is very difficult to use it across the board right now, unless you're lucky enough, fortunately I am, to only have to support platforms that have got full web component support across the board. And that's a wonderful place, which I hope everybody will be in the not too distant future.
Yeah. We're totally, big fans of it. But, you guys, help point it out. It's a little early, I think, for us to adopt it. But we will. That is on I think we're in a two-phase approach here to adapting all in on web components. And we're kind of in the in-between phase right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an entirely reasonable approach myself. I'm a fan of use what you can. You can't necessarily, I'd love to use everything that's brand new all the time, but realistically, that's not ideal in most cases. You have to support odd platforms. I mean, you talk about CSS vars and how they apply to things and the various polyfills. It gets complicated. I ran into a bug in Edge the other day because I didn't realize that Edge would not do calc of calc. Apparently it's a bug that's fixed in the next build. But it really broke a lot of things regardless of the polyfill, because the polyfill is like, I don't know what you want me to do with this. That supports vars. Yeah. So you're constantly battling that thing. And I don't think, just saying, we're going to use it all, particularly in your guys' situation, where you have a very large existing user base. I mean, and how is your user base sort of, you've obviously rolled Stencil out. It's out there now. You find that your users are taking to Stencil?
Well, so in general, yeah. So we're getting a lot of, we spoke at the Polymer conference a couple weeks ago. So we've gotten a lot of great feedback with it. And so we're still in alpha yet. We're currently porting all of Ionic Angular. So all of Ionic Angular is built with Angular to build Ionic components. But largely, we're not calling it a rewrite, it's more of a port because it is just kind of the same JavaScript and the same CSS. We're just making sure it's in more of the generic web component fashion than kind of very specific Angular APIs. But yeah, it's been well received. Ionic itself, Ionic 4 will be the first one to use Stencil components with the ultimate goal that it's still kind of the same Ionic Angular that everyone knows and love. So if you're on Ionic Angular 3 right now and you upgrade to 4, there'll probably be some slight changes here and there about like how you set up the slot attribute versus like ng content. Other than that, we really want it to be the same. And Ionic Angular users don't have to know about the word stencil, don't have to know what it's doing, don't have to know anything, don't have to learn anything new. That's not the goal of this. It was more of a goal for us as authors to make sure that it's reusable across everyone. But the users still get to choose what framework they want to use, or no framework at all. They could use jQuery Mobile for all we know. It's up to them.
With that sort of upgrade path going forward, what are some of the sort of additional things you guys are looking to add? I mean, we've talked about things like shadow and whatever, but obviously Stencil's still pretty young as you move into the next phase of version 4. Do you have a lot of features on the roadmap? I mean, what's your roadmap look like in terms of things that you guys want to take Stencil to the next level?
Yeah, as far as Stencil is concerned, a big goal of mine is to pull away more API. So there's actually, if you look at the docs right now, there's really not much to it. It's largely just an ES6 class, and it's got decorators, which are, I believe, stage 3 right now. So you have the component decorator, the prop decorator, state and method, and that's really about it for the API. So what I want to make sure that we do is to not add new features. We don't want to add new things to learn. We want to keep it as low level as possible because it can be. Because largely we're relying on the compiler to do all of the heavy lifting. And so So a big goal of Stencil is to not get involved really in anything and just let the developers code what they want to code, and be as standard-based as possible. And so anything that can be done in the at compile time should be done. So we're trying to make sure that nothing is in the runtime. If you inspect the network tab, when you refresh the Stencil site, you'll see that the files are all very, very, very small as is, and we want to keep driving that further down. But kind of the next big thing that we want to do with Stencil is to make sure that we're using ES module imports. And we already have a plan for that, and how we're going to accomplish that. But that was also a big goal of ours, is to not depend on other libraries. And so we're big users of Webpack, big fans of it. It's a great tool for many applications, but one of our goals was to not use Webpack because it's not a browser standard. It uses CommonJS. We want to make sure that we're just staying true to the browser, and ES module imports was perfect timing for us because that's exactly what we're looking for. So we kind of want to make sure that we're enabling that same thing. And so under the hood right now, we're using Rollup to bundle everything together. So we would continue to do that, but bundle it down to the lowest level. So if you have 6 levels of imports, that shouldn't all be a separate request. And I think there's plenty going around right now of people saying like you shouldn't use ES module imports because they're going to be slow. Well, that's not necessarily true. If you had 500 imports that are all separate requests, that's going to be slow. But if you're smart about the bundling of it, which is what our compiler can take care of, we can bundle it down into one file and lazy load that file on demand, which is exactly what Webpack does. And so we want to do the same concepts of Webpack, but rather use the standards to pull that off. And we feel that's more of a future-friendly way, not having to learn Webpack config, but you're just learning how the browser works, and reading the MDN docs is kind of our goal.
And also,
modules looks exciting. I mean, I like the concept of modules. I'm hoping for the best. I'm gonna miss HTML imports. I'm sorry. I'm saying it. I liked HTML imports. I wish it would have stayed around, but I understand the need for modules.
Yes, and that was part of the decision process too. Is as we were researching Polymer and Vue and everything, it became clear that HTML imports was something we should not implement. So that's we stayed away from it.
Yeah, I don't think it's a shame. I mean, I know why, but obviously there's not going to be a lot of implementation around it. JS modules and the way that everyone wants to do that looks like the way things are going to go. I think things will pop up around it, but I mean, have you guys started to experiment with actually that roadmap plan? Because I know obviously it just landed in Chrome with module support. Have you started to work through paradigms of like how you're going to approach that in terms of the way you bundle or the way you group or the way those things are loaded in? I myself have not much touched modules yet, so I have no formed opinion yet.
Yeah, actually, there is when I was at the Polymer conference, I was able to meet one of the Google developers, Sam. I cannot recall his last name, but he created a project called SourceGraph, which is kind of exactly what we're looking for, where it uses Rollup to bundle down to the lowest level import. So let's say if you got two components, and they each share the same import, and then that import that it shares has 500 imports. Rather than each component importing 500 imports, it's going to bundle them all into one file, so then there's only one request that's shared. And let me see if I can share this with you guys.
Yeah, you're talking about Sam Sircone's Bundle Buddy tool, yeah?
No, actually,
No?
Sam Thor is his
Sam
GitHub.
Thor.
Is his GitHub. So I just put a link on there. So I had a great conversation with him and his so this doc kind of outlays how it kind of bundles them together. I'm not aware of Sam Siscone, what he's doing, so it might be similar. I'm not actually sure how it works, but the real goal is that we reduce any network requests and bundle at the lowest level as you can by creating kind of a dependency graph in the compiler first. And so on our machines, we're able to get this to work. It's actually pretty slick, just making sure that it's scalable across all things across hundreds of thousands of users, that's the next problem.
Also, one cool side effect that we get from using modules too is if a browser supports ES modules, you can be pretty sure that it also supports the ES6 spec. So one thing that we've also talked about is shipping basically two different compiled versions of Stencil. So one just going from TypeScript to ES6, and then the other being an ES5 bundle. This way, you'd be able to, if you have ES modules, your browser will get the ES6 version. So you get all the nice performance optimizations that are going on in V8 with ES6 stuff. And then also, if you're on a browser that doesn't support ES modules, there's the no module attribute on script tags, and that would be basically the current way we do it now, where it's an ES5 build of Stencil. So I'm pretty excited for being able to ship ES6 to browsers finally.
So the talk you gave at Polymer Summit, Adam, obviously there's lots of nice slides and some really cool code examples, and it was obvious kind of how lightweight Stencil is and how nice it is to kind of author vanilla web components in it. For people listening who haven't actually seen that talk yet, could you try and paint a picture in their minds of exactly how you might author a vanilla JS web component and the kind of, you've already mentioned the properties, but if you could try and describe it in a little bit more detail, that'd be ace.
Okay, I will try to describe. So we do use TypeScript. I don't think we've hit on that enough yet. And just a real quick backstory about TypeScript. When it first came around and Angular 2 started using it, so we worked with the Angular team quite closely on it. And they told us we were going to start using TypeScript, and I was totally against it. I was like, oh, man, we don't need types. Get your types out of my dynamic language. I don't need this stuff. But I reluctantly started adding it because users all wanted to have Ionic components typed. Like, they wanted to know what properties are on it. So it's like, fine, we will start typing our stuff so that you have types, because you use TypeScript. As we did that, it became very clear to me that this is a very powerful tool. We found so many runtime bugs that would have happened. We found where many arguments that match up with parameters. So a lot of bugs surface as we start porting things to TypeScript. And I did a complete 180 about how amazing this is. I love TypeScript. And I'm kind of now at the opinion that all of our code is in TypeScript to not provide types to users, but it's purely for ourselves and building a large application and having a large team that's working on it and users that can contribute to it and not worry about issues that are going to arise from it. The side effect being that now all of our components are typed for users. So yeah, Mishko of the Ionic team will quickly tell you about how I was against it and how I completely did a 180 on that. So that's just kind of my spiel about TypeScript in general. I think it's a great way to build applications, especially for large teams, and a lot of developers working on that. And so that's why we felt that we personally can build components quickly using TypeScript. So we thought, well, why don't we bring that same concept to Stencil? Because we feel it's a great way to share components, to reuse other people's components and have it typed. And because it's a compiler, this isn't kind of a runtime problem at all. It's not any additional baggage that we have to add to the runtime of anything that's happening. So it's it kind of really worked out and played in our favor that TypeScript is the compiler, and we're able to use that. And because it has transforms, just like how Babel has transforms, we're able to manipulate the original source code to make this highly optimized web component that works everywhere. And so that's kind of like why we went down the TypeScript path. And also, custom elements in general, or being able to extend HTML element looks exactly or is identical to how ES6 class and how TypeScript all works. And so to kind of envision our component, it really is just a normal ES6 module. And each of the properties can have types. And so this, again, helps you out because if, let's say you have a checked property and you say that it's a Boolean, well, that checked property, it can also be an attribute, but an attribute can only be a string. But because we have a compiler, because you told us that it's a Boolean, we're able to automatically convert it to the correct type. And this isn't you having to come up with a crazy syntax of how it works, but rather it's just you coding a really robust, well-designed API for your own component. But then also at runtime, it's able to figure out the correct, be able to parse things between numbers and Booleans and all that. And so it's largely just another ES6 class with types, and then it has decorators. And so if you're familiar with Angular 2 and above, or just Angular, it'll feel exactly right at home of how the decorators work, because you're able to signify that these properties are these properties are a prop, which is what Angular would call an input, and what Vue and React calls props. And then you can also identify what things are methods. And so that's, again, so that you can expose what should and should not be allowed for users to be messing with. And so it's a great way to encapsulate your code. But if you're familiar with ES6, you're familiar with web components, or really React, really if you're just familiar with kind of the latest frameworks, it's going to feel right at home with how it's all designed. And yeah, I'd encourage you to take a look at our talk from the Polymer Summit a couple weeks ago.
You also define a render method as well, which automatically gets called when there's properties and attributes change and those kind of things as well. Is that right?
Right. I keep missing kind of the biggest things. Yeah. So we have a render method, and this is largely based off of React and JSX. At this time, we use JSX, but we also kind of feel like this can be something of an opinion of which one you prefer. So I know quite a few people still prefer kind of the AngularJS or Vue.js templating system. That's something that we can also do as a compiler. So it's kind of choose whichever rendering engine you want to choose. But in the end, our compiler is going to boil it down to what exactly we want to see, and then allow us to optimize that and be as tiny as possible, be already pre-compiled, not have to parse it on the fly, not have to ship a compiler that has to parse it apart in the browser. So there's so many benefits to having a compiler and allowing us to do all the heavy lifting on your computer one time rather than everybody's computer a million times and ship them the code on how to do that. And so, yeah, the render method is exactly that, where it's JSX. And a lot of this, so again, we're just heavily inspired by Vue, which I would say is heavily inspired by React.
Yeah, one cool thing, so like here at the office, we have Vue internal projects that we're building with Stencil. And when I get questions from the developers working on those, like how do you do this in Stencil? Normally my answer is, how would you do that in Vue, or how would you do it in React? Because that's pretty much how it's going to work in Stencil. But the key being, like, you don't have to pull in a huge React bundle to be able to use that feature. It's just built into the compiler itself.
Yeah, and I also I really want to add that we don't see, I don't want Stencil to be seen as like a competitor to other frameworks. We're not trying to take over Vue or Angular, but rather the components that you generate are they complement whatever framework you want. You don't have to worry about it. The biggest thing we see as Ionic as the company that we find out is that many companies, even small companies, have a few departments, web departments, and each one gets to choose what framework they want to use, depending on developer preference or the team's preference. But at the same time, they wanted the ability to share components and not have to worry about them breaking, and constantly that JavaScript churn that we all experience of updating frameworks and learning new APIs. We want to avoid all of that and allow a Stencil component to just work everywhere, and just to work. I know it's going to work 10 years from now. And so that's why we're not trying to have an API, or there is no API in the runtime. And even the compiler's API is very, very minimal. So again, Stencil can be used to build applications on its own, but I don't want it to be seen that way. I want it to be seen as like the components that you generate can be used everywhere in whatever framework you choose, because kind of the framework is the glue to a large application. So we want to enable developers to use what they want to use. And that's also the large kind of source of why Stencil is built the way it is.
It is odd to me that everyone feels like everything new that comes out is an immediate competitor to everything else. In a world of web components, interoperability is like sort of a key component to that thing. I can compose them, I can put them other places. I don't really think people are competing as much as everyone thinks. I mean, you see the arguments on the social medias and whatnot, which always kind of crack me up, because some people take it really personally, and you're just like, you can use what you want.
Yeah, right.
Please build your component with this thing and then use it over here if you like. That's kind of the goal. Well, I only do it this way. Okay, don't be angry at
Religious
me.
words. Yeah, it is interesting how it plays out, and that again kind of to the history of Ionic, as we've been traditionally Angular focused, and we're like, well, these other frameworks are amazing too. We love Angular, we love all the users, we love the Angular team, but it's a big world and everyone has different solutions, and so we're like, all right, so let's get around to building Ionic and porting it to Vue, and then we got to port it to React, and that's where we just like took a step back. It's like, well, let's rethink of this. Why don't we make it in more of a scalable fashion that's something that's reusable everywhere rather than having to reinvent it for each component, API. Because realistically, again, as we ported Angular to Stencil, it's largely the same stuff. It's all the same stuff. And so we don't want to keep reinventing it with little quirks and then have to follow, as we update between framework versions. It's just such a pain. So we're trying to avoid that. And same for all their users too.
And the internet will thank you. Maybe not right now, but eventually when...
Yes, that's the goal. We just want to, I don't know, there's so much churn right now and everyone is experiencing it. It's very difficult. Everyone's kind of fighting to write applications and just do their job, but we're having to keep relearning everything, and I think that's a big waste of time. And that's why I love web standards, and I think that's the biggest, understated, thing that we're all using today. Like we're the browser and how it works, the standards, having all these companies agree upon the same API, just document and window, all these things are just standardized. Just everyone has agreed upon, and there's trillions of devices with this already installed, already has a execution runtime, everything's good to go. Let's just use that. Like that's already there. Let's stop reinventing everything. And so that's kind of the big, my personal goal with Stencil with that is just use the platform.
Yeah, and that's so much more possible nowadays because of how quickly, browser vendors are bringing out new APIs and those kind of things. Where before you'd have to wait 6 years for anything new to come out. So that's so much easier now and so important.
Yes, thank you. I lived through that decade. It was interesting.
And since we're talking about different frameworks and stuff, I'll try not to go off on tangent too much, but just to have a shout out to Vue.js. I've very recently been playing around with it quite a bit, and I've just been blown away about how simple and amazing it is. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knows how awesome Vue is.
Yeah, same here. Huge fan. Again, I hope Stencil isn't seen as a competitor to Vue. It's going to complement it, and it's largely inspired by it. Actually, we brought this idea to Evan Yu probably way back in January, December. We had a chat with him and brought this whole idea about what we wanted to do. And it was his idea to not use Vue, but to go one level lower and use SnapDOM, which is the same thing that Vue uses for the render. And so if you look at our renders between Vue and Stencil, it's the same one, which in the end boils down to like 1.5 kilobytes. But it's the same one. And huge credit to Evan for giving us this idea of not like kind of shipping Vue, but even going lower and keeping it as low to the wire with web components as possible.
I always love how we as web developers, 1.5 kilobytes. It's low on that wire, right? We're not shipping much, and then I end up having to download a 300 meg pack of something just so that I can unlock a file on my Android device.
Yes,
it blows my mind. Blows my mind every time.
Or a 10 megabyte video which auto plays as soon as you try and read anything.
My favorite example is the picture of Super Mario Brothers, and it's saying that like this GIF is larger than the entire Super Mario Brothers file, like the entire game.
Oh, that's gold.
It's so true. Yeah,
I remember that too. That was hilarious.
Well, we're coming up against time. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show today. If people want to find you on the internets and on the intertubes of things, where might they look?
Let's see, Adam D. Bradley on Twitter, or really just ionicframework.com or stenciljs.com.
Yep, and at Justin Willis 96 on Twitter for me. I am slightly addicted to Twitter. So if you hit me up on Twitter, I will most likely answer you pretty fast.
Yeah, absolutely follow Justin. He's got some good stuff. He is on the ball.
Thank you. But yeah, Twitter is the best way to get a hold of me. And I urge everybody, like Adam said, to check out stenciljs.com. We have it's still early on the docs, but we're doing a lot of cool work there. And the other cool thing to mention is stenciljs.com is actually built with Stencil. So
yeah, view the source, take a look for yourself.
It's really amazing stuff. I've been looking at it since you guys released it, actually, and I think it's pretty trick. I think developers are really going to take to it. Leon, you got any closing notes before we close up episode 138 here this week?
Only a small note. So the Polymer Summit talk that Adam was giving is available on stenciljs.com. I think that's the right URL. Yep. So it's on the homepage. So go and check that out. Really good talk.
Fantastic. Well, this has been episode number 138 of the Web Platform Podcast. Tune in next week when we talk more about the web and things you should probably know as a web developer. We've been your hosts, Justin Ribeiro and Leon Revel, and we will see you next week.
Goodbye, everybody.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.